One of my favorite compliments a customer ever told me was like, you guys aren't really in like the access restriction game. You're really in the like granting people access game, which I think is a different way than a lot of security companies approach their world. They're all about restricting things. It's different when you're a startup. You're trying to like acquire one new customer every day versus when you go into a thing that already has thousands and thousands of customers. You have to balance your overall growth of your company. You're not going to survive and win off one customer. It could be Google is your first customer. It just doesn't matter. Like, you need other people.
You're listening to the EnterpriseReady podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of EnterpriseReady and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we power the world's best enterprise software. The EnterpriseReady podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of EnterpriseReady, we're speaking with Paul Querna, the CTO and co-founder of ScaleFT, which was acquired by Okta not too long ago. Paul likes to say that ScaleFT is in the business of granting people and machines access to the systems and endpoints they should be reaching. We get some backstory on the company's founding, and we focus on the zero trust concepts that ScaleFT evangelized that had their roots in a white paper published by Google that defined a new model for enterprise security called BeyondCorp. We dive pretty deep into why BeyondCorp is needed, including the previous status quo, things like access control lists and VPNs. It gets quite technical, but I found it to be a super interesting conversation, and hopefully you will too. Finally, we wrap up with a discussion of what it's like to integrate into a large vendor's existing go-to-market process. All right, here we go. All right. Hey, Paul, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Grant. Great to be here.
Cool. So as we get started, I'd love to just hear a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into enterprise software.
Sure. I've kind of always been in infrastructure, whether that was more operations side or more making software. And I had a long background kind of in open source and a kind of the Apache software foundation. And it was probably almost 10 years ago now, I got involved in this startup called CloudKick, which where I was the first employee. And it kind of turned into a enterprise cloud monitoring system. And that was kind of my first exposure in a product company making enterprise software versus just working on infrastructure.
Great. So after CloudKick, what did you get into?
So CloudKick was actually acquired by Rackspace. At the time, Rackspace was trying to build out its OpenStack cloud. And so we really turned into kind of one of the teams there that was building many different cloud products for enterprise customers. And so that was a really good experience where I worked in a mix of product development, product ownership, and corporate strategy for how we went from kind of Rackspace's origins as a managed hosting company to trying to beat Amazon at building a public cloud. And so there's a lot of experiences there that kind of informed how I think about enterprise software.
Cool. So after CloudKick got acquired, you stayed at Rackspace a couple of years, and then was your next step, was that ScaleFT?
Yeah, so I was actually stayed at Rackspace almost 5 years. And then I founded ScaleFT with a group of friends who actually all at the time worked at Rackspace. And we kind of started ScaleFT based out of our kind of experiences at Rackspace around security, around how DevOps teams are operating in clouds. How do you make that more secure was kind of our initial nugget. And we kind of took our experiences from Rackspace, not all of which we can talk about because no one likes to talk about your stuff getting hacked, but kind of how do you address that in a way that DevOps teams don't hate.
Cool. And then the outcome at ScaleFT was?
We were acquired by Okta back in July of this year, which was a pretty fast and fun ride. And it really, through ScaleFT, we started really marketing the BeyondCorp approach. And I think it's really awesome. We ended up at Okta, where that kind of approach is like heavily believed in as well. It's kind of a cornerstone of modern security.
Cool. And so now you're kind of scaling out your product within the Okta customer base and beyond.
Yep. It's all about scale, go-to-market scale, product scale, security, compliance. Like, it's a whole different level. It's different when you're a startup. You're trying to like acquire one new customer every day, versus when you go into a thing that already has thousands and thousands of customers, you need to scale even faster than you thought you had to before that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so now I want to dive back into some parts of the story. First, I think we should just talk about the foundational concepts behind ScaleFT and sort of like tell a little bit more of that founding story, like how you started going to market, you started finding some early customer signs, like just talk about the early days of ScaleFT.
Yeah, so ScaleFT, we started with server access. So one of the things we saw in our previous jobs was, when a security incident happened, it kind of like lingered a long time, a lot of times. Like someone would break in using maybe something creative, maybe something really silly, but then their goal was always to pretty much always steal a credential so that then they could stay inside the network, right? It's way better to steal someone's SSH key or steal their password and then keep logging into things as that person than to always using a 0-day or always you trying to find some exploit in some PHP web app. And so kind of the lesson we were first tackling is if you're familiar with kind of privileged access management as a category, it's a kind of a legacy category that says, hey, we're going to take all these secrets and put them in a vault, and then we'll rotate them once a day. And that one, that just didn't work in cloud environments. Two, it wasn't very effective. And three, like how you even authenticate to that thing was often your static password. And so we kind of said, hey, how can we make an access management product for DevOps people where they enjoyed using it, where it was kind of built into their workflows? Like we didn't want to break Ansible from working, but every other product out there at the time, like you couldn't plug it into Ansible. Like that was like our first requirement was all the DevOps tools I'm using, they have to work. And so we kind of brought kind of a meet people where they are thesis and make their environments safer and more secure.
Oh, okay. So the founding principle was basically that the world has changed. Now we use automation and DevOps. A lot of the security tooling around, privileged access management just aren't designed to work in that modern environment. What can we build that sort of understands that paradigm shift and solves this problem in a modern context?
Yeah. And that's how we kind of enter the market. We said, hey, you have DevOps teams. They're on cloud machines. They're on on-prem machines, but they're starting to use automation. How can you do that in a way that is secure, in a way that supports them instead of kind of hammering them down and saying you can't use automation, which is a big gap in how the PAM market was approaching it. And it was kind of through that, when you start like breaking down, like what is access management? One of my favorite compliments a customer ever told me was like, you guys aren't really in like the access restriction game. You're really in the like granting people access game. Like you're helping people be successful and get into things, which I think is a different way than a lot of security companies approach their world. They're all about restricting things. And that kind of was where we cut into some of the beyond core concepts of like, by default, you don't have any permissions. You upgrade people, you give them temporary grants of permissions, right? That is like one of our building blocks. We were building that in our product even before we kind of like adopted a lot of the beyond core monikers.
Okay, yeah. So you start this company, you are entering the market, probably like a handful of early customers, maybe friendly folks that you're talking to that are using your product and giving you feedback in the first year. Is that right?
Well, we kind of hit a bump in the road pretty early. We got a large scale, multi-million-dollar enterprise deal in our first 6 months. And, we only had the 4 founders at the time when this deal kind of floated into us. And, it's one of those deals that your friends and advisors, that's kind of a split vote. Like some people were like, don't take it. It'll distract you from building a at scale, repeatable business model. Other people are like, take it, it's money, and we ended up taking it. And we spent almost a year kind of working off the debt from that, but it let us do so much more, like it's a balance.
I would vote to take the money as well.
Yes, take the money, because otherwise you have, we had seed money at the time. We would have just ran out of money.
Yeah. Okay. So you got this early big customer. Can you share who that was?
It was actually Rackspace.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. It turns out when you have a relationship with a company and you've done great work there and, you go off to solve a problem that was a problem for you there, they can be an early customer. Makes total sense.
Yeah. Although, I think it was an arm's length relationship. Like we went away for 6 months and then they said, oh, wait, what are you guys actually doing? This is really helpful. Can we be your first customer? So
I think this is a somewhat common thing that happens for enterprise software companies, especially where people leave and then they've seen this problem and they're like, this is more than just a single company. We should solve this. But the context that you're bringing into that is often the problem that you solved from, you saw at your previous role. So you end up building a pretty well-tailored solution for that first customer.
Yep. And then the challenge is, of course, you have to go get 1,000 other customers. I mean, this is the advisor side of this. Like if I was consulting someone in a similar situation, it's like you have to balance your overall growth of your company, right? Like you're not going to survive and win off one customer, no matter how big they are.
Right.
It could be Google is your first customer. It just doesn't matter. Like you need other people. So it's a balance for sure.
Also in the world of like venture funded companies, getting a multi-million-dollar deal means that you need to get 3 multi-million-dollar deals the following year in order to still triple and have the growth that you want to have. So
yeah, many lessons there. I think, even just describing optics there on what is recurring revenue, what is non-recurring, there's a whole separate podcast about discussing large enterprise deals with VCs because a lot of it's recurring, but some of it is kind of non-recurring. That relationship with your customer is important to figure out because their needs are going to change over years, and you don't want to have a weird pricing relationship with them too.
Yeah. So setting up some amount of non-recurring revenue early, which is kind of professional services, custom work that you might be doing, integration, implementation, and then having a recurring fee on top of that.
Yep.
Okay. You kind of discussed before this, you mentioned it a couple times, Beyond Corp, right? So for those uninitiated, what is Beyond Corp? And kind of describe this concept, where it came from.
So I think before we describe Beyond Corp, we have to describe the last 30 years of security.
Yeah, it's a good idea. What problem was Beyond Corp solving maybe first? Not just,
Yeah, the context of this is really a lot of security was built around the network for a very, very long time. It's like Cisco has Cisco certified network associates and engineers and security engineers, and their entire job in many companies is literally configuring network ACLs. And there's processes and products and a whole ecosystem around, hey, I'm getting traffic from one place, identified via an IP, and I want to whitelist it or blacklist it or analyze it. And, that worked okay when you had kind of flat enterprise networks where one team could put a ticket in and approve that you're adding a web server somewhere and then add a whitelist. If you have a top-down perfect vision of the world, it's an okay architecture. What's challenging is when your employees don't work in the office, when your apps are hosted in random places, when your organization is so big that it's hard to exchange information about, hey, where did that web server go? Did its IP address move last week? I don't know. Those are kind of the problems that push you towards a new model, right? And I believe I would describe it as a model that focuses kind of on layer 7 attributes, who is accessing what, and then finding ways at an architecture level to authenticate, authorize, and encrypt that in a way that has a good user experience, right? And so kind of in the late 2008, 2009, kind of one of the triggers of this is Google was hacked by the Chinese government. Operation Aurora, there's a whole Wikipedia page about it.
Supposedly hacked.
Supposedly hacked, right. Sorry, everything's alleged.
Yeah.
Although they did write a pretty pointed blog post and the Wall Street Journal reported on it. But yeah, Rackspace was also involved in that supposed incident. And inside Rackspace at the time, the path taken was very different. It was hey, we're just going to put firewalls everywhere. We're going to put VPNs in front of everything. We're going to really harden our network-centric approach to security. And what that really led to, though, was as an employee, my user experience was terrible. We actually were in situations where we had people working on open source projects, this is a full-time job, on OpenStack. And from the office, we egress filtered GitHub, because we were worried about people exfiltrating traffic to GitHub. And, if that's your job to work on GitHub, you can't do your job anymore. But we did that for a good reason. We're trying to stop an attack. But it was very disconnected because our network view of the world was we didn't have any other hammers. We just literally had a ban port 22 was the hammer we had. And so there was this big, Operation Aurora, Chinese government. And it's Google, they said, hey, one, never let this happen again. This is not acceptable. Two, we need to kind of rethink this from the ground up, right? How do you actually go about doing access management in a modern way, in a scalable way, where disparate teams can make their app ship to a bunch of employees and not have to open a ticket with central IT to like change an ACL somewhere, right? Like, how do you eliminate things like VPNs that are very clunky, right? Like they have a bad user experience. Your VPN drops every day, every hour, every minute, and you're frustrated by it.
So what's an ACL, first of all?
Access control lists, right? It's so
Great.
If you're coming from 10.00.1, you're let in. If you're coming from 192 to 168.2.1, you're not let in. And you would assign people ports, like when you plug into a port in the office, right? You get an IP address.
Like a physical Ethernet port.
Yeah, like a physical Ethernet port. You would get a specific IP address that you're in engineering, and engineers allowed to go, to this set of addresses. But if someone from accounting plugged into that port, they might be able to access all the engineering stuff, right? Like that's, a decade ago, 15 years ago, that's where the world was in a lot of internal security was like, it's physical. It's based on where you are. Like your IP address determines all your access. And you could see that like doesn't work very well, right? Like pretty quickly.
Explain to me why would that have ever worked really well?
It worked in a model where like you come into the office to your desktop computer and you're accessing, 4 servers that are 2 floors down.
Okay.
But that is like literally the Cisco reference architecture for how an office should be set up for 30 years, right? Like that's how your office is supposed to work.
And so this is before those servers were exposed on the internet. They were only exposed, like you could only access them if you were,
at work,
in that,
at your desk.
Yeah, at your desk. And it's probably similar to like, maybe that's how, what did they used to call those thin clients, right? Used to work.
Yeah, thin client with a mainframe sitting somewhere else. Like
yeah, but like it's sitting somewhere on your premises in your environment that you could like secure the access to from a physical perspective. You had it in a closet with a lock on it and a cage with a lock on it. Like, you had to use a key to get into that office. And like, so they were physically securing all of the resources and to secure, who can access that server from inside the building, like, everyone can plug in Ethernet. So like, let's just lock it down to these IP addresses and we'll use an access control list in order to specify who can access it. And that is like how we'll determine access controls.
Yeah. And in fact, your like PCI audit will pass because like, that's good.
Still today, it'll probably pass, right? Like
it would still pass with that exact same architecture.
Like,
and
despite the, the many differences, it's like, well, that's the PCI architecture. So
yeah. And look, so obviously things change, right? Like employees use Wi-Fi, employees work at Starbucks. Like your servers are now on Amazon.
And so like for a while, I'm guessing people were like remoting into their desktop computer. And this is like the, what like go to my PC and these other technologies they would use. And like, so you're basically like somehow getting access to your PC remotely. And that's what you did. And then eventually they created VPNs, right? So
even better than that, I mean, there's a whole market category called VDI, which is like literally virtual desktops.
Oh, okay.
Like, yes, there are products that do exactly what you're saying because we're locked into the security architecture. We couldn't like fix the security architecture. Instead, we gave people virtual desktops and VPNs to like live in the old architecture.
Yeah. So, I mean, eventually the VPN was like probably like, this is better than, remoting into a specific desktop, right? Now you could actually use your same laptop and like use a proxy into the overall network, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a huge advancement. What an improvement, right?
Well, what's funny about VPNs is like, look, there are some companies who do a very, very good job of maybe managing the VPN. But for a lot of companies, it's kind of a carte blanche access mechanism, right? Like you get in the VPN, you can access every app, right? Even if, you really only want to access the wiki like from home once in a while, right? Like the VPN became kind of a one-place hammer. You're like, well, we're going to put 2-factor on the VPN, or we're going to do X at the VPN layer. But then the VPN really only understood, layer 3, layer 4 protocols.
Yeah, I was, when I first read the Beyond Corp paper, I was actually confused. I was like, wait, people just put these services on like their internal networks and then don't put any authentication in front of them, and you just need access to the network. So like all the communication is unauthenticated, and then you can access it from a VPN, which you use as your authentication layer. I was like, that doesn't seem good, right?
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at incidents, security incidents, over the last 10 or 15 years, like it's definitely not good, right? Like from an attacker's perspective, from a threat model perspective, it's open season. Because the other thing is, once you're in the network, you lose identity actually, right? Like when you make a request to the wiki doesn't know who you are, right? So from an attacker's point of view, it's a huge advantage. The request to the wiki was never authenticated and authorized to go to the wiki. It was just that like some laptop got on the VPN.
Right. So, it's in this trusted network and now I can access it. And like what it's doing, you don't really know. You just know that it's like
that's right,
doing stuff inside the VPN.
Yep. And so then, like, by the way, I mean, because you had this architecture, people built products to try to make that better. You have a whole generation of network packet inspectors, right? Like there's a whole category of products where their goal is to like, let's look at those packets that the VPN can't understand and try to understand them, right? Like this is what I'm trying to articulate is like the old architecture, we just kept trying to patch it. Like we said, okay, we're going to start with network ACLs. And every time there's something that doesn't work well about that, we're going to invent a new product category like VPNs or VDI or deep packet inspection to try to like make it so we can keep using network ACLs.
Yeah, I mean, because you have a system set up and then you like realize there's a problem. So you like try to solve each of those problems incrementally as they come along rather than like questioning the entire system, right? Because that sounds expensive and complicated and like a project that no individual sane person at a company is going to undertake as like I'm going to totally remove everything that we've ever done in this space and like invent something new.
Yep. But that's the basis of a movement, right? Is like a generational shift in technology.
I mean, eventually, like, it sounds like what happened was at Google, this thing like got so bad and they realized that like the current system was so fallible and terrible that it was unsavable. And so this like big, Project Aurora, is that what it was called?
Operation Aurora.
Operation Aurora, right?
Yeah.
Comes and like kind of exposes this and like everyone's like, well, we can't protect against it in our current model. Like we're just not there.
Yep.
So let's throw it all away and start.
Right. And Google wasn't the only one to come to that conclusion. It's just when you're Google, you're able to put a large number of engineers and security people on it for a while. And then a few years later, like after it works, you can write a white paper about how awesome it is.
Yeah, they don't write white papers about the ones that didn't work.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, yeah. You only read the white papers about the projects that went really well.
That's right. And look, and if you look at even like Forrester wrote some analyst papers back in 2010 where they coined the word zero trust. BeyondCorp was the Google project name for the internal development of the system, and kind of zero trust was kind of the broader industry-wide message around like that whole network perimeter thing. Like you can't base trust decisions based on that.
Yeah, I think we eventually started to refer to it as like what, hardened shell GUI center.
Yeah. Castles, moats, all these analogies, they really actually describe how it fails, right? Mm-hmm. Like everyone understands a castle has a moat, and once you're through the moat, like everything's over.
But like I also do think whenever you're looking at these enterprise problems, it's important to go back to the beginning and be like, look, this made sense. Like this was fine. It was like totally rational. Like you're not dumb people for having thought that this was a good solution to the problem at some point, right?
Yeah. Constraints changed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Constraints changed, but like, okay, now we know that. Like, let's try to invent the better solution. Let's just acknowledge that it's not going to work. It's not like get all defensive and try to be like, oh no, but that's what we know and we have to stick with it. And let's just like, let's change.
I love your perspective, but the challenge is, and even as a startup trying to educate people around these space, like, BeyondCorp to a group of people that are Cisco certified is not an amenable like alternative. They're like, but then I won't have a Cisco firewall to administrator. Like I'm not trying to take away their jobs, but in some ways I am.
No, you're just trying to get them BeyondCorp certified.
Right. That's right. We're working on that.
I guess my perspective is just that everything that's happening, like we just have to be more welcoming to change and acknowledge that change is going to happen.
Yep.
And be willing to like look at our current systems and be like, does that still make sense? Like, let's question everything, right? And if it doesn't, let's like build something that does, or look for a solution that solves this today.
Yep.
Okay, so let's dive into what is BeyondCorp, right? I think we've gotten pretty good at what the problem is and why it made sense. Like, let's talk about what the solution is.
So I tend to think of it as taking it from a layer 7 approach first. So what are the things we want to accomplish at a layer 7? Authentication, authorization, encryption, like all the things you expect when you go to even like a consumer website. It's like, it's encrypted. Like when I log into my bank, they knew who I am, and I'm authorized to only mess with my bank account, right? And so how do you take those kind of concerns and make them something that it can be kind of platformized, right? So that it's not up to every app to implement them themselves, right? So the traditional enterprise stack would be like, if I'm deploying a new enterprise app, I put in my own load balancer, my own firewall, my own WAF. I build all the ACLs myself. I build a custom SAML integration if I'm lucky, or I back into some LDAP server. We want to take that whole stack and make it kind of a platform feature, right? Like, you could describe it almost as building all those features into the load balancer. And that was like, I would say like a big chunk of BeyondCorp.
That's kind of that access proxy.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the other parts are kind of more implementation detail of like how for you as a company do you manage devices, or how do you assert trust about different factors. But like that is the core bit that I think is actually the thing you need to like repeat first, is like, how do you try to consistently implement authentication, authorization, and encryption, right? It's like how do you make your front door like a really good front door, even though we're trying to avoid analogies about castles and front doors. Like try to almost productize that little component. And then around that, you see like Google did a lot of work on what people are calling like device trust, right? Like, can I trust that this MacBook Pro is up to date and patched and all these other things? But I tend to view those as really factors for authentication and authorization. They're inputs to your decision, just like a U2F key is a good factor. Maybe a Chromebook having its own TPM is a good factor. But those are really inputs to authentication and authorization.
Okay, so define authentication versus authorization so everyone has the same context.
Well, part of the problem with that is I'm a kind of a contrarian, I think, on the view of authentication. So authentication in theory, like a almost Wikipedia definition, I think, would be like, it's identifying who you are, that you are Grant. And, Grant has this job and this title. It's kind of like almost a directory lookup, right? It's like, what are the things about you? And it's really just trying to establish that, like who you are. And then authorization is, are you allowed to do something, right? And that's a traditional split of kind of auth-in and auth-z is first you just focus on who someone is, and then you focus on can they be allowed in. The reason I'm a contrarian on those is like authentication is not absolute anymore. Right? Like the factors that we use to determine who you are relative, right? Like you remembering a password you share with 400 other websites is a very bad authenticator, right? Like any one of those 400 websites can take your password and use it again. A U2F key is a pretty good authenticator, right? It is cryptographically secure. It's a little device, unless someone steals your keychain and also knows your username and your password, like that's a much better authenticator. So I tend to think of authentication as kind of relative, like there's different kind of almost levels to it. But that in a traditional sense would be how you describe authorization, right? Is that MFA traditionally is thought of as an authorization step. Like you need MFA to access a site is like an authorization statement, when it's really asserting that your authentication is stronger. So I think they're actually highly intertwined. And if you look at how people write authorization rules, they're often making assertions about how good the authentication was.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so just to add to the confusion, they're even more intertwined than I think most people think of them, because some people think about them interchangeably, right?
Right.
In most of the world, like authentication and authorization, like, yeah, you could use one word instead of the other. In this context, they generally mean different things. But in your perspective, authentication is a spectrum.
Yeah.
Right?
And how much you want to trust that spectrum is an authorization decision, right? Like, I'll let you into the phone directory for the company, even if, you just know your password. But I'll only let you into the wiki if you MFA, or if you have a U2F key, or your boss approves to let you into some finance app. Like, those are attestations of identity, really, in the traditional sense.
All right. I mean, it kind of touches on a few points around, that this is a complex topic, and authorization and authentication are kind of maybe there's not a totally defined world where everyone like thinks they mean the same thing.
Oh, I mean, there is in the canonical Wikipedia sense.
Okay.
Right? Like clearly authentication is just who you are. I just think one of the things you really kind of understand, I think the Beyond Corp thesis and kind of where we came from network identity. Like network identity used to mean your source IP. That was like a good enough identifier. That was your auth-in. It's like you came from an IP address. And what I'm trying to say is password as your auth-in factor is flawed. Like most people would agree today, password authentication is flawed, right? And we're like, well, U2F's better. Well, today it's better. I don't know if it's going to be better in 30 years. I hope it's better in 30 years, right? Like these factors are changing continuously based on our trust levels of them. And that is in traditional sense, an authorization point of view.
Okay. I like that from a timescale perspective. It's like, look, if we look at everything, if we look at even authentication as an authorization, that's like a time-oriented and delineated piece, then we understand that like that while that is the strongest form today, it might not be the strongest form in 30 years.
Right.
And, okay, so let's go back to just the Beyond Corp. Like, what does the end-to-end experience look like on Beyond Corp? So I think we understand what the end-to-end is for network-based, ACLs and all that. It's like, just describe the end-to-end on a Beyond Corp or zero trust system.
So from my point of view, the end-to-end is as a user, I go to a resource, whether that's a web app or something else, and kind of transparently to me, a bunch of magic happens, and then I'm logged in. And that thing that I'm logged into, whether it's the wiki or some other app, knows about me. It knows what I should have access to. And that connection is encrypted and safe and audited. I mean, that's the end-to-end experience. I mean, it's really describing almost like, what is it like to log into a SaaS app that has SSO set up? Like, it's pretty close to that. And in some cases, you can even make it better than that. You can actually get rid of a lot of even prompts for people, like re-enter your SSO password, right? Like, we can actually eliminate a lot of that. So I think of it from a end user perspective. It's very crisp. It's like, I literally just go to whatever I want to go to, and I'm logged in.
So there's no VPN, right?
No, yeah. I open Chrome. I mean, the Googler point of view would be like Chrome is the basis of all this. But so you open your browser and you go somewhere. And now, if you're not trusted because you don't meet the access policies, and like from a security team point of view, from a internal engineering point of view, the viewpoint is very different. But I'm just trying to say from a user point of view, it's a very clean, crisp experience. It's either you're in, or if you're not allowed in, we try, at least in our product, to tell you why, right? Like, you weren't allowed in because your OS is not up to date anymore. Apple came out with a patch 5 days ago and you haven't patched yet. Like, if you want to self-remediate that, we'll help you do that. Some things you can't self-remediate, you need to go down to the help desk and they'll fix your laptop for you.
Okay, so that makes sense from the end user perspective. It's a seamless way to authenticate, and then the app knows who you are, so it can like give you access and who's doing what in your internal applications.
Yep.
But as like product folks, like, what does it look like on the implementation side? What's happening?
Yeah.
What are the details in this?
So yeah, generally you have kind of in the traditional world, you use like a policy enforcement point, an access proxy. It's somewhere that you're centralizing control. Like, you're treating it almost like a cloud feature. Like Amazon has load balancers. We have access proxies. And all my apps just go behind those. Once they're behind those, it's that component that deals with authentication, authorization, encryption, and kind of the policy mastering, right? So the security team, most large enterprises have kind of a information classification document, right? They say people's personal phone numbers are, classified as low, but any customer data is high. And if you're accessing something high, you have to have MFA'd within the last hour.
And so generally there's like a NIST matrices that like describes this, and it's like basically looking at confidentiality,
impact,
availability, like all these different factors, and then you grade them on like low, medium, or high, and sort of if it's highly, needs to be highly available and it's highly sensitive, then it's like classified as high, like sensitive data or something. So
and that's like most companies have some kind of classification. The reason they classify is actually to derive policy, right? And your CIO or CSO, if you work at a big company, is signed off on, hey, high means this, these types of documents, and it means we have to use these access policies. And so that's what the access proxy really enforces is, as an app owner, I just need to classify my thing. It's low, it's medium, it's high, right? Like I have customer data in there, or no, I don't have any customer data. It's like, it's the lunch menu, right? That's my role as an app owner. I classify my data. Then the security team can say, okay, great. For everything high, these are our policies. For everything low, these are our policies. For low, the cafe menu, we're going to let you log in on your hacked Android phone. Like, we just don't care. It's the login, the cafe menu. But the thing with customer data, you have to be on a managed machine that's managed by IT. It has to have been patched within the last day. You had to have MFA'd within the last 2 hours. Like, all those kind of policy decisions can be driven by the security team based on the information classification.
And that sort of logic is living in the access proxy.
Yeah. I mean, part of, I think, doing BeyondCorp is you have to kind of understand your resources in a way. Like, it's kind of a resource-aware system, right? The resources are not hidden here. Like, you kind of need to know, because one of the things you want to do is you also want to create an audit event of Grant logged in to the finance system 48 hours before we're announcing earnings and then bought a bunch of shares of stock. Like, you actually want to know that. You want to audit that. So the auditability is also related to having kind of a resource graph.
And then the benefit is there's no VPNs. You're putting that access proxy on the public internet most of the time.
Yeah. But part of that is also just centralizing responsibility. How I tend to think of it is, it's like, if you have one team that is good at running one thing on the internet, like, it's way better than having 100 teams running individual things behind a VPN, right? Like, in most organizations to deploy BeyondCorp, there's like a small number of people who are actually responsible for kind of their access proxy equivalent.
Okay, so it's a shared resource across all these different teams, and they're able to...
A center of excellence, I mean, to use a big company word.
Okay, and this is used... primarily for employees to access internal tooling, correct?
Yeah, I think that's where the origins kind of started. It's where Google described in their white papers. It's all about employees and contractors. But even some of our customer base, it's like, if you acquire a company, and 6 months later, you're trying to get them access to random things, you don't want to give all 5,000 people of that other company access to your VPN. So it's employee access, contractor access. But I think in the context of, like, what do you trust? What are you trying to assess about a person? How do you classify information? How do you classify an access attempt? You'll see in the consumer side that this already exists, right? Like, how fraud detection is done for credit card transactions is already, like, not trusting your IP address very much, right? They know that the bad guys can fake an IP from San Francisco, right? So in the consumer world, a lot of these concepts about how do you derive trust, do you trust a factor more than another, already exists. Like, Google does it in Gmail. If you fly to Hong Kong, it's going to ask you to MFA again, right? Like, consumer products already deploy a lot of these techniques, and we're kind of like taking the IT version of it and making it more employee-centric.
And then, taking advantage of some of the, you have more control over the environments that your employees compute and access things with, right? So you can use accessing an internal tool as a impetus to get someone to apply a security update on their laptop or on their phone, right? To update the latest version.
Yeah, I view it as like self-remediation whenever possible is helpful. And Google published even some numbers about this, I think, in one of their later white papers, that they saw, I think, a 30% reduction in help desk tickets. And that's just about having the context what the user's trying to do, right? Like, when you're on a VPN, like, your VPN either successfully connected or didn't. And so there's very little room for, like, helping a user be like, hey, we're not letting you into the wiki today because, you haven't updated to the latest iOS. Like, in the access proxy world, you can actually return to them an HTML page that says, hey, here's what you need to do to go fix it.
Yeah, so instead of every application needing to do that same thing, it's like, just put that in front of, even accessing the load balancer, you need to hit this access proxy first, which does this sort of like coarse-grained access control to verify that, like, you've got the latest system, we know who you are, and then you can start to go into the trying to access the internal resources.
Yep, that's right.
Cool. And so, one of the other things that I think is really interesting about this from kind of stepping back out of the details of BeyondCorp implementation is ScaleFT's sort of adoption and flag carrying of this topic. And I think, when I look at enterprise software companies, one of the important go-to-market techniques is sort of this movement-based marketing, right? Where you want to create a movement in order to get other folks to sort of sign on to what you're doing. And you guys didn't work at Google, you didn't write the BeyondCorp papers, you didn't do that, but you took the flag for BeyondCorp and you really brought it to life in an ecosystem.
Yeah, I think from a startup point of view, it's an efficiency argument at some point. You're always going to have less capital than some public company you're kind of competing with. You're always going to have less people for a long time, right? And so my belief on movements is you get kind of a spin wheel going, right? Where, initially it's really hard. You're trying to do your first meetup and 3 people show up. That was our first BeyondCorp meetup. And we're like, okay, how do we get 10 people next time? How do we get people who are interested in this topic? We know that people are interested in the topics. Some of them follow me on Twitter. How do I go get them to come to the meetup, right? Next time 10 people showed up. Next time 50 people showed up, right? It builds upon itself. That's why you want a movement, right? So in theory, that 2 years down the road, your cost of acquiring a customer is lower, that you are known for something. And part of that, I think, in the context of enterprise software is, customers, they need both a need for your thing and they need to know about you, right? You can make the best damn, some container product right now or best service mesh thing in the world, but if it has 1 star on GitHub and no one knows about it, it just doesn't matter. And so I think the movement thesis we had was, we got to make some good product. We got to be interesting. We got to fix actual security problems. But when an enterprise realizes, one, they have a need, and they do all the time. Everyone's always redoing their VPN architecture or deploying a new app on EC2 or whatever. They have to then, 2, also know about us, right? They need a friend that said, hey, did you read that BeyondCorp thing? Or did you go to a meetup about this? Or see some tweet about it? They need that first intro to your kind of ecosystem. And a movement and movement-oriented kind of enterprise software, I think is a pretty efficient way to do that.
Yeah, and you did a few really interesting pieces around it, though. One is you literally adopted it from Google, right? You took their white papers, you built a website around it, you published it.
Yeah.
You didn't probably have permission to create the website and stuff. You probably just did it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, we did it. And we knew one day Google, when they did, they said, come visit us. And you don't know, are they going to be angry or happy? And I think in Google's case, they're just, there are many different parts of Google, and some parts are really excited and some parts are confused.
Their marketing team was we were going to do that someday.
Right, someday. And then the people who actually worked on BeyondCorp was that's cool. We're happy to see more people like this idea.
Yeah.
And I think for us, we just tried to keep it really clean. We weren't trying to be slimy. We were just trying to be look, this is a good idea, right? Google gave it a word and described how they did it. How are you going to do it? How are you as a Fortune 1000 in the Midwest, thinking about these problems? Trying to frame it in almost a iterative model. Google's an example of it working. That was where we really try to frame a lot of our kind of content marketing is, Google shows us that it can be done. They showed us their vision of it, but you're not Google, you have way different constraints. You don't make Chromebooks, right? Google has some advantages here. So how are you going to take some of those core ideas and apply them in your own business, right? That's kind of right sizing the message in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's just an interesting way to do it, right? To say hey, look, Google wrote a white paper about it. We think that's really good. It fits. You didn't start a company around the BeyondCorp paper. You sort of had this company going. You realized the thing that they were publishing was pretty much in line with what you were doing.
Yeah.
And something that you said before we started recording was that it helped you kind of establish context, right? So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a startup, you're always like told make your elevator pitch, right? And what is an elevator pitch? It's really a compression of what you do. You're trying to like have one sentence. You know, we're Uber for microphones or something. Like, what does that even mean? You're definitely not Uber. You know, they're like valued at $100 billion and have tens of thousands of employees. So you're not making microphones that are like Uber, right? So you're trying to compress it down. And what we found is like BeyondCorp was a pretty good compression word for us, right? It compressed down like, how are you actually thinking about authentication, authorization, and encryption? Like, how do you actually implement that? Are you doing it in this old school way? Are you doing it in this new school way? And if someone talked to us and had already read the white papers and we said, yeah, we're like doing BeyondCorp style stuff, but for DevOps, it was a super easy conversation, right? It was a great compression word that just got us over the hurdle of like, no, we don't need to explain like why static passwords are bad, you know, for the first 30 minutes of the meeting, right? It lets you just move really fast. And you need things like that as a startup. Your time is really valuable. And also assessing if a customer's ready for you, especially in the enterprise context, is so important, right? Like the worst thing is to like work with a customer on and off on the kind of enterprise timeline. And then like a year in, they're like, actually, guys, you know what? You're just way too far out there for us. Like you want to find people who already read the paper, already believe in what you're doing, and are like, how can I bring that into my big company? You know, that is a huge leg up like down your funnel.
That's a great point. Yeah, you create this aspirational sort of thing, and like they did a great job of naming it. The papers are really helpful. It puts this new concept in. It does it in a very like academic, googly way, and then you can say, look, like here's the first steps to implementing this, right?
Yep. You know, we viewed Google as like, you know, not to say Googlers are certain ways, but like Googlers are like summiting Everest. Okay, like they're way out there, man. They're summiting Everest without any oxygen, okay? Like, we're going to help you get to base camp. It's beautiful up there. It's still something to look at. It's still, like, way better than where a lot of people are. Like, let's get you there.
Yeah, you're not going to, like, build your own hardware and, like, rack all of your own, you know, machines and, like, recompile every bit from the ground up for everything you compute on, right?
Right. But like we can make it harder for like when an employee, you know, leaks their password for bad things to happen.
Yeah, right.
Like, and we can use this new architecture to do that. Like
take care of the things that actually happen a lot that like we don't have great solutions for, and make that like, hey, here's the first steps.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so you take this thing, you get it moving, and then you get acquired. So now you're inside of Okta, which is a publicly traded company.
Yep.
And Okta's core business is sort of around kind of single sign-on SAML concept, right?
Yeah. I mean, they call it an identity cloud, but yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it. Like it's, I kind of summarize, it's like growth engine for many years was, how do I SSO into Salesforce, which is a great growth engine because everyone was buying Salesforce.
Right. And I think the team from Okta started at Salesforce. And
that's right. Yeah, the founders are both from there.
Maybe even like I know there's definitely some pieces of like the SAML protocol and SCIM protocol, which is like written by Salesforce. So they helped kind of lay the foundations for these things too, right?
Yep.
Okay, so now you're inside of Okta, and like, what are they doing with your product? Or are they going to scale it out to more customers? What's happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting process. You know, you go from a startup mindset of like, you know, frankly, how do I get one new customer at a time, like, or two at a time, or, you know, how can I go to a conference and meet the right people, to like, how do I arm 1,000, you know, salespeople with the right thing, and how do I scale this to thousands of other existing customers, right? And so there's technical scale challenges, like, you know, you have to grow up real quick. Thank goodness for the cloud in general. It makes our lives way better. You know, there's a lot of collateral challenges, like how do you educate a lot of people? They know about SAML, they know about SSO, but they maybe don't know about BeyondCorp very much, or about, you know, how privileged access management has traditionally been talked about, you know? So like there's a big mix of kind of scaling challenges there that hit throughout an organization.
I just kind of had this realization that maybe SAML was how you interacted and got access to external applications. Do you think about BeyondCorp as how you get access to internal applications in Zero Trust?
Yes. I mean, yes, I think the summary version is yes. I think what we're learning though, and this is one of the reasons Okta acquired us, is they wanted to take many of the techniques we were doing for internal applications and apply them to external applications as well, where the access proxy, in the same way that SAML works, right? Like you want to take all the device context, self-remediation, real-time awareness, dynamic policy stuff that you had in kind of this internal world, and you still want to apply it when you log into Salesforce, because again, back to the CSO's worldview, they're just marking things as low, medium, or high, right? If Salesforce is high, you need all the same policy enforcement there. So yes, they're just both ways to enforce policy, but I think we're learning from the BeyondCorp world how to make those things exist in kind of the SAML SaaS world.
Oh, interesting. So the lessons from that internal and access proxy for internal resources, taking that and applying it to how you access external resources.
Yep. And you want very similar outcomes. So, and this is like also as companies are modernizing, right? Like very few companies build everything themselves. And at the same time, very few companies are 100% SaaS based, right? Like almost everyone has both.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously think that the world will continue to leverage internally hosted applications on a VPC that you secure with BeyondCorp. And I think you'll also access external applications that you integrate with SAML. And there's probably some combination of the two technologies that happens now with, like Okta and you guys together. So
yep, that's right.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So what I want to dive into though is I think there's this really interesting piece around go to market from a startup perspective. You're like, okay, we got to build this movement and we got to get a few people to believe the thing that we're doing and like create advocates and get 10 people to show up to the meetup and like be very like brute force. And how do we create something from nothing?
Right. 0 to 1.
0 to 1, right?
Yeah.
All day long. And now it's like, okay, we're inside of this bigger organization. What do we need to do, like process-wise, to systematically enable this organization to be successful with this product that we've built?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so, like, what does that look like for you right now? Like, tell me about that process.
You have to kind of align to how people already consume content, right? Or how organizations already work. So like a lot of what we're doing is like aligning to, the big beginning of year sales kickoff right now, right? Like how do we go into sales kickoff with everything figured out so that as a salesperson, they're like fully enabled, to really hit all their accounts with at the beginning of the year.
So first of all, that's like that sales kickoff is sometime not in 2018.
No, yeah, it's a different timeline than as a startup. You'd be like, what am I doing like on Wednesday?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like,
you're planning 3 months out at minimum.
Yeah. Everything's like that. But look at this, because you have salespeople in Australia or where, it's a different type of scaling, and it's good. Like you can get a lot of leverage out of it, right? I'm excited about that. So we're trying to like align to ways they already consume information. You can't force them to do new things. You can't be like, we're going to do sales education differently than the rest of the company. No, you got to do whatever the process is,
And what does that process look like? So it's sales kickoff. What do you need to deliver for that?
So all kinds of collateral. I can't emphasize it enough. Like battle cards about how you stack up against a competitor. It's like context setting, slide decks. Like you've never heard of anything in BeyondCorp. Here's like a level 1 deck. Here's like a level 2 deck of like a little more in depth. Here's a level 3 of like really, really in the weeds. Here's how you enable like people at the edge to listen for the right words. Like what are the things a customer will say to be qualified? Like how do you qualify them? What are they going to say? What problems are they going to describe they have to know that this product is the right fit, right? And if they say that, what does that person then do? Do they bring in a specialist? Do they say, hey, we're going to connect you for 30 minutes with a specialist next week? Like how does that whole thing get rolling? And really trying to turn that into just like highly repeatable in a way that like, I think as a startup, you kind of hack it until it breaks. You don't really have the luxury sometimes for this, I think, when you kind of are dropped into a big system.
Right. I mean, so first of all, like battle cards, you said that. So that's how you stack up against a competitor? So you would, generally you describe, kind of their pros. I mean, to be honest, like even yourself, because it's an internal document generally. You're not necessarily giving this to a customer.
Someone who, in our case, we do a lot of kind of privileged access management. A lot of our salespeople spend time on what you call traditionally IAM market, and they're worried about Active Directory. They don't know about how some of our competitors really work. So they need almost like a 1-pager or 2-pager kind of fact sheet. Like, here's what this competitor is good at. Here's what they're weak at. Here's how we stack up. Here's how our roadmaps are different. Trying to really summarize information so that person, when they're on the phone and someone says, "Hey, what about X?" Like, they need to have an answer. They can't just be like, "Well, I'll get back to you in like 2 weeks." Like, it's a whole different sales experience to then say, "Oh yeah, I know about X. Look, we're honest salesperson here. We're a little bit better in this area, and we think our roadmap is way better." You can disarm a lot of kind of customer concerns very quickly by being knowledgeable. And so you want to build that for people that may not spend every day, reading about BeyondCorp. It's kind of scaling that knowledge graph.
So it's kind of like you could answer every one of these questions like that someone might have about any of your competitors, any of your roadmap, technology, everything else. It's like pushing that knowledge to the edge, to the people that are talking to customers regularly in order to scale like all of your knowledge into the rest of the organization in a way that they're used to consuming that information.
Yep.
So that it's easy for them to pull out the battle card and review it before the call.
Yep. And look, it's not a perfect process. Like, you'll get questions that get pushed up like, "Hey, customer X just asked, how are you dealing with TLS 1.0 deprecation?" And like, "Well, I didn't put that in the FAQ because no one ever asked yet." So there's some work you can do ahead of time. Like, these things are going to pop up. And then there's always just stuff that, you didn't know someone would ask.
I mean, stuff that you have answers to, or you can figure out the answer to, but but generally you're trying to capture all that and enable people in a way that they can then have those conversations and feel successful and stop having to because there's going to be some amount of stop and go, right? Okay, the level 1 deck, then the level 2 deck, and level 3 deck. You're not going to go through all of those in a single meeting, but you want to have it sort of escalate correctly where at least the first 100 people can go through level 1, and then maybe there's 20 people that can do level 2, and there's 10 people that do level 3, right?
Yep. It's kind of subject matter experts, depending on how you phrase it internally.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's not just about enabling that sales team, though, right? Like, there's other organizations that you're enabling along the way.
Yeah.
So, support might be one.
Support's a great example. I think, especially in enterprise context as well, especially for, Okta as a product is authentication related. So, if Okta is down, you can't log into anything else. So you have to be good at support. When a customer calls on the phone and says, "XYZ user can't log in, I think it's your fault," you need to figure out real quick if it's your fault. And if it is, fix it, right? And communicate clearly and accurately with the customer and update your status website and all these kind of processes that are built as a company grows, right? The first time that happened, there wasn't a great process for it. So as a product that's getting jump started into this, you kind of start with even at ScaleFT, we had most of our customers on Slack channels, shared Slack channels for both support and kind of technical onboarding. As you get bigger, that's not great. You can build tools in the Slack. We had all kinds of Slack bots that would track SLAs and are we getting back to someone fast enough? But they're used to working in shifts and having tickets and having queues that they work through. And that's a much more at scale approach to support. And so we have to go into their world again and say, "Hey, we're going to start with, let's use your tools. Let's get our team on your ticketing system. When a ticket comes in that's related to our products, phase 0, and this we basically started with is we'll take the ticket. We'll try to figure it out, just as we would a Slack request from one of our original customers, right? And then over time, you try to layer in okay, there were 8 tickets about some feature. Let's write a little knowledge base article about that, an internal article, turn that into an external documentation as well, and kind of processize the whole thing. And eventually, you're not handling basic questions. And eventually, they become harder questions. And then eventually, they're you just end up getting bugs, which is great, Yeah,
because, unless your support team can fix your bugs, which would be pretty
That'd be great, too.
Okay, that's super interesting. I think that the idea of taking something and enabling these other organizations or teams within your larger company to do the specialized thing that they do is really important, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of product. That's what we kind of have to do is be able to walk and talk between all these different organizations and make sure they have the things that they need and we facilitate from engineering into these other orgs to make it successful, because our previous company got acquired and we were rolling it into this bigger company and working with all their systems. And at first you don't want to let go, but eventually you kind of just have to. It's the only way you get sleep at night is by hooking into their NOC and their, all these other like systems. And the other funny thing is like just how similar the structure is at like every enterprise software company, right? Like everybody has like some type of GA, general administrative, that's your legal and some of these in finance. And then you have your sales team and your marketing team and your support team and customer success and product and engineering and QA. And, it kind of goes on. And like the interactions between those groups, if you run infrastructure, maybe you have a DevOps or ops team, and, it's always the same. And like the funny part is I've found that the people in those roles often have the same conflict across different organizations, right?
Yeah.
The natural tension that lives between product and, sales.
In every org,
Yeah, or between sales and marketing.
But it's also about scaling it, right? Like that is how, engineers go off for 2 months and build a feature and don't have to check with everyone and the rest of the company all the time. And the same thing with sales. It's like they're going to go off to Milwaukee for 2 weeks and like try to get a big fish, and try to land a customer. And they're not going to be involved in every single thing going on in the company. That you have to kind of let people operate on their own. And that just leads to natural kind of goal drift and, just differences of short-term goals, especially.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think we think about sales enablement and these other pieces, but like, are you still managing your own infrastructure, or have you handed that off so that there's...
We have meetings about that often. Right now, we're still running our own infrastructure, our own DevOps team. Actually, one of our leaders last week was like, we didn't have our own finance team. We were a 15-person startup. We didn't have our own finance team. So we should definitely use like Okta's finance team, right? But we had our own couple of DevOps people who are really good. Like maybe we build a little nucleus there and then keep growing that little group into their own DevOps team. And I think that's the same thing with our sales team. We had 2 salespeople at ScaleFT at the time we were acquired, and like they're becoming our kind of specialist overlays for our product across many other salespeople, right? So it's kind of almost like for each one of those orgs, you kind of figure out like, what are you going to keep independent and kind of run as its own way? And what are you going to kind of, take kind of the bigger company's existing processes? And I think it's just org by org and case by case and size of your group. You kind of decide. I don't think there's any hard or fast rule.
Yeah. No matter what, you're kind of making some of these decisions as a startup. You're like, oh, we'll outsource our finance. Well,
Oh, one of my co-founders, Robert, we're like, hey, Robert, do you want to do like basically support and customer success? Like, just for like 6 months while we figure it out, and we'll hire someone to do customer success, in a while, like just because, we're all busy. And like, so he's an engineer, and he's like, sure, I'll do support and customer success for 6 months. We'll probably hire someone in 6 to 8 months and go from there. Well, it was like 9 months. We hadn't hired someone yet. And then we got acquired. And then like, he's now the support guy. And he's like, well, no, dude, he's like an engineer with like 20 years of experience. He's not the support guy, like he's a founder. Like, let's get him back in engineering. But like, oh shit, he has to hand off and scale support knowledge before we really get him back, Yeah,
it just says never take the support role for your co-founders. It's a risk you don't want to take.
Yeah, you're going to end up running support. That's just, I think how a lot of founder stuff ends up being, right?
But it's also so important because if everyone does the sexy, cool job, it's like you're never going to do anything.
Yep.
You have to put really smart people in charge of the monotonous, grinding, like hard tasks, like doing support really well, or doing infrastructure well, or like doing any of these pieces, like, QA, right? Like the funny thing is these are the hardest roles to hire for because engineers want to do engineering things.
Yep. As we were hiring engineers, the engineers got to do engineering and the founders got to do all the other stuff. That was our first 4 engineers basically just worked on engineering. And then all that did was free up founder time to like do other stuff, not engineering.
Yeah. I think that many times founders don't really realize that that's the sort of life they're going to live. Is like you start a company maybe because you love building great products and you have this experience and you want to see something come to life, and you build the first version of it, and then eventually you're handing off all of the like stuff that you thought was fun, and you're diving into like, how do I scale a customer success organization and a support organization and like a sales team, and go raise money. So
or how does pricing work, or like 1,000 questions. Yeah. You got to learn how to, but as you get bigger, you're also trying to recruit and find people to take over those things too. It's, it's not very rarely is it permanent, but like for that next 6 months, you are customer support, or you are, in charge of finance. That's just kind of how I think of it, as you kind of like specialize in something for a while and then try to find the best person you can to take it over.
Yeah. Real quick, just changing subject onto I'm going to take a guess onto how your acquisition happened. I have no idea if this is correct, but I just, based on my knowledge, I'll see if I can nail it. I'm going to guess that either you or they reached out in sort of a partnership-y type of idea. You spent a little time specking out what it would look like to build something together, and then eventually they were like, we should just buy you.
That is directionally, how it went. I think what happened with us is, I would say
and it probably took a while to negotiate the deal, but at some point it happened.
Forever. But we kind of started out with our pipeline, right? Like, when we started, we didn't have any customers using Okta, but as we were getting bigger, I think at one point we had like 70% of our pipeline was like already an Okta customer. Like we could ask someone and they're like, oh yeah, we use Okta.
Oh, wow.
Especially on enterprise, like the bigger the company got, the more likely they were already using Okta. And that was kind of the overlap that I think drove some of the deal, is like we were talking to very similar buyers. And even if it wasn't the exact same person in the company who bought Okta, they like sat next to the person who bought Okta.
And had you created some type of integration first?
Yeah, like you could log into our product with Okta. We were doing like SCIM integration with Okta. So a lot of protocol level integrations.
You're one of the 4 companies that have implemented SCIM, I see.
Yeah. If you want the Go bindings, we have an open source library for that.
Oh, cool. So, obviously the EnterpriseReady site talks about how to implement single sign-on, and SCIM is this protocol for actually like provisioning and deprovisioning users based on in like the SAML world, right?
Yeah, and group objects as well.
Right.
Groups are probably actually where it gets more interesting, right? Because then you can do kind of delegated permissions. So just getting users there is like okay, but like when you start doing groups is where people find the value.
Oh, interesting. The reason that I always thought it was valuable is because sort of single sign-on was never really like populated user tables. It wasn't designed to. It was designed to like get you into the thing. And so if you had a user table, like how did you know who was using it, like and what they were doing? And so people would do something called like just-in-time or real-time provisioning of users, which was kind of a hack. And then like you didn't really like ever deprovision that user. You just sort of like let them not log in anymore.
Right. And actually, the context of SCIM, I think, is going to continue to be more important as you think about a lot of privacy regulations and other stuff. Like you actually need to deprovision a user when someone leaves a company. Like you can't just keep their data around. Like, so I think in general, you're going to see more protocols like this because just keeping data forever is not cool.
Yeah, and it just makes sense to like not have users around after you had like they don't work there anymore. So you want to kind of move like, because oftentimes you seat-based pricing and things like this that become a reality. Okay, so we're back to like the acquisition.
Yeah.
The reason I suggested that is because oftentimes people will ask me like, well, how do we sell the company? And it's like, well, like my opinion is you don't just like go sell the company. You like build a relationship with potential acquirers. You start to figure out like what's interesting for like an integration, a business development deal.
Yep.
And eventually like they kind of realize that like the thing you're doing is very complementary and maybe there's an opportunity for them to sell it to their existing customer base.
Yeah. Like
the value is like the thing that you have, if they can go sell it to all of their customers, it's worth a lot more to them than it is to you.
That's right. That's the board deck at some point is like, we're going to pay, quote, low price for them now. We're going to take their thing and sell it to 4,000 people by the end of next year or whatever the exact numbers are. And that's like using their existing salespeople that you're going to go educate, right? Like that's the argument is that they have an efficient way to sell your product actually, right? And you
often at a higher price, and faster,
and bundled,
right?
and all the contract mechanisms, and like Okta has their SOC 2 Type 2 report. Like we didn't as a startup. Like that's actually a barrier to a lot of our deals. So I think a larger company just having things like compliance already done, right? It makes deals easier. Having already the contracting done, already went through procurement at a Fortune 500, like those things matter a lot. They're barriers. They're what makes doing a small enterprise startup really hard. And so big companies kind of skip those. So if your product's in the right place, they can see a lot of value in it.
Yeah. I think when we got acquired, the company that acquired us literally sold our product like 3 weeks later for like 100x the price that we were charging. So it's like, but we weren't charging enough, obviously, but like they were able to really turn it around and start to make more money faster. And so, it's just easy. And like when you think about the enterprise value that you each have, it's like, well, in their hands, your technology and team is a higher enterprise value than if you keep it independent, at least today, right?
Yep. And like, I think to your point about, how do you get acquired? It's like a long thing. I mean, we knew people at Okta for well over a year before the deal happened. Like it wasn't an overnight thing, but you also want to be out there. You want to meet people in your industry too, right? Like I think one of my good friends and co-founder, Jason, was like, he had no fear like calling anyone from any other company and just saying, hey, we're ScaleFT, here's what we do, and like you need kind of to be out there and saying like, call your competitors, talk to them, go have beers with them. Like they're people too. It doesn't need to be a big, you're not enemies. So go meet the people in your industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly true for the bigger companies that are your potential acquirers in the end, right? Because, even though it's like not a popular topic, like it's important for founders to have relationships to know what their options are, right? You're not building this thing to get acquired, but the idea that you understand, just like who your next potential venture capitalist might be, it's good for you to know who your next potential, exit might come from.
Well, it's not about the exit in my mind. It's even just like understanding how they think about the market. Like if they're like, oh man, we're only doing FedRAMP and government customers now, like I'd be really scared. Like what do they know about the market that I don't know? Like it's just like market research, and like people are people. They'll tell you what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So it's the advantages you get from spending time with them in person, understanding how they're thinking. You kind of get to formulate your opinion even more on other smart people who see the market and see everything else that's going on.
Right. And if you ever are, in a situation where you're getting acquired, like those kind of decisions, you can't just, email corpdev@microsoft.com and get an answer back in like 12 hours. Like, are they interested? Like to your point, you need the relationships if it ever does happen. Yeah.
It's just one of those things that it's not talked about a lot, but I think, part of the goal of this podcast is to talk about the things that don't get talked about. And, that's one of those pieces where I think you just have to be thinking about it a little bit, know who's out there, because it's also like, there's companies that you might want to acquire. You might raise your next round and think about acquiring, and that's who's thinking about acquiring them as well. So like you should be kind of just constantly in tune with that side of the equation.
Yep.
Cool. So what one thing, if you're up for it, that I've had a handful of guests do, which has just kind of been fun, is I just would love to hear how you pitch what your product does and why it's important to people.
Yeah. It's actually hard because I'm like in the middle of like re-pitchizing it to like how Okta would approach the problem. So for ScaleFT, like I would say like pre-Okta, right? Like we started with how old is your SSH key, right? Especially if you're talking to a DevOps person or a sysadmin, you're like, how old is your key? Right? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I generated it like 2 or 3 years ago. You're like, are you sure? Like, can you prove that to me? How old is your coworkers? Like, and they're like, oh, actually, I don't know. Like, and then some people are like, oh yeah, my key's like 8 years old. And you're like, well, wait a minute. So you've had a key for 8 years. Have you had the same laptop for 8 years? Have you ran untrusted software on that laptop in 8 years? And the answer is like, oh yeah, I've had like 4 laptops. One of them was stolen, and I run untrusted software on there all the time. And so like, you're like, great. So you have this thing, an SSH key. That's the key to your kingdom, right? Like you statically install it on a server, and given that private key, you can log into that server. But you have no way of testing to where the key's been, whose laptop it's been on, who else has it, right? Like as an attestation of identity, it's really bad. right? So what does ScaleFT do? We move that attestation to be a dynamic real-time thing without static keys. We make that from a static problem to a dynamic problem. And that's really what we do, is we make key management and access management a dynamic policy-driven thing.
Perfect. That's great. Also, I acknowledge and love the challenge of like, you're like, oh no, I'm in the process of repitching it in this new context.
Yeah.
Right? That's hard. Like we're going through it replicated like a sort of, I call it product extension, where we built this new thing. And now I'm trying to tell the pitch and the story in context that includes that new thing, which like from like 100 feet away might not seem like it's consistent with what we do. But like when you kind of hear the whole story, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. But it like takes a lot of effort to craft that message in a way that like is consistent and makes sense with like this larger organization, right? So as like a side note, I would like potentially just talk about how like internal authentication, like internal app, versus external, and like you're kind of bridging those two worlds or something about that. I mean, now. I don't know.
Especially in the context of Okta, and I was just trying to get to, is like in the context of Okta, that is 100% the story, right? Like it's we're taking this dynamic policy-driven world, applying it to both internal resources and external resources in a consistent way, using device trust and MFA and U2F tokens and driving user adoption of those things. So like Okta has all these features for like workflow around enrolling a U2F token and getting it verified by your IT team that it is a valid U2F token. Like those are kind of the features that drive outcomes for customers. And that's what I was trying to say. Like the Okta worldview is exactly what you said. It's taking internal resources and external resources and putting them on an equal playing field for how you do kind of policy-driven access management.
Yeah, that's cool. It's so funny. Like those two pitches are so different.
Yeah.
But like the same product.
Same product. Because what does the product do? Well, it does some crypto, some RSA operations.
It's hilarious. Like the delta between two pitches for the same product, just like the context, right? Back like matters so much. And like, how do you want to frame it? And like, what's the future? And like, how's it going to work together? And, it also, I think it is also a signal to like what you're going to be doing more of in the future. Because it kind of gives some like, oh, okay, well, like that's the problem we're focused on and so this solves it in this way. But like, that's the problem is a little bit different than, sort of, SSH key replacement.
That's right. And it's also the difference between, trying to like win over like one engineer and one sysadmin to like get your foot in the door as a small enterprise vendor, and kind of a more holistic long-term relationship story, right? Which I think you can, as a larger publicly traded enterprise software company, you can have that story. But as a small startup, they're more worried about you like going away. Like you almost don't want to tell a big story. You want to tell like a really small story. And they're like, well, worst case, we can replace it, which is kind of, I think, a difference of scale,
That's funny. So you think that it's at a smaller company should be cautious about telling too big of a story when it comes to customer conversations because the risk gets too big.
Yeah, the risk is way too big. And enterprises are risk adverse. I mean, not to oversimplify it, but they are.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting.
And that's why, that's also why open source is just a adoption mechanism, right? Like it's lower risk because it's open source, right? Like because, worst case, that startup went away, even though we were going to pay them for the open source thing, like it's still going to be open source. It de-risks a large enterprise.
Yeah, it's very true. Like that idea of what happens if you go out of business, like was like always a very common question in the early days of Replicated, partially because we were telling a big story around like how we were enabling the future of enterprise software within this organization. And then you're right. And like, maybe it's better to like tell a smaller story and then expand over time. I do have a favorite moment of that when finally someone asked, instead of what happens if you go out of business, they asked like, what happens if you get acquired?
Yeah.
And I was like, this is, how the tides have turned.
Yeah.
We are no longer worried about us dying, worried about someone buying us.
Yep.
Cool. Paul, thank you so much, man. This has been a real pleasure. I really appreciate all of your insight on Beyond Corp. it's funny, like we have to spend so much time up front getting the context, right? Like,
yeah,
hopefully for a lot of people, over time, that concept, like the context is compacted into that one statement and people get it. But hopefully this is that thing that'll help them get that in the future.
Yeah, I hope so.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.